Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill. Don't worry, I'm not going to try to sing it. We probably all remember being entertained as kids watching that video of how a bill becomes a law. What they never told us, however, is that there are lots of different types of bills and lots of different ways a bill may or may not become a law. Our guest is Chris Micheli. He is an attorney and founding partner with the government relations and advocacy firm of Apria and Micheli. Chris has co-authored, I was going to give you a promotion here. Chris has co-authored several books on California politics, including A Practitioner's Guide to Lobbying and Advocacy in California. He also teaches as an adjunct professor at the University of Pacific's McGeorge School of Law. My gosh, a busy schedule. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So the legislative process is a lot more complicated, and that little jingle we learned as kids, for example, is something called sponsored bills. Can you explain what they are and their role in the legislative process?
Yeah, and it's important to note here one of those differentiations between federal and state legislation, because in the U.S. Congress, sponsor refers to either the United States Senator or the House of Representatives, the member of Congress, whose name is on the bill. They call that person the sponsor. In California, the legislator, the state assembly member or state senator, we simply call the author of the bill. The sponsor refers to a third party, someone outside the legislature generally, a special interest, a constituent, local government, etc., brings the idea for the bill to the legislator, and they are the sponsor, and that's listed in the analyses and on the
I was going to ask you, how do we know if a bill is sponsored? We just look it up?
Yes, once a bill gets analyzed in that first policy committee hearing, they'll actually have a notation under the list of supporters. The first one who's listed, it usually says in like parentheses or somewhere, sponsor. And so they're identified right off the bat.
So what happens when a sponsored bill gets hijacked?
Well, any type of bill can be hijacked, but that means that the legislator is unwillingly giving up their bill. Hijacking almost never occurs in the California legislature today. 25 plus years ago, when I first started lobbying in Sacramento at the state capitol, there were a few limited instances, but today that doesn't happen. In other words, the bill author gives up his or her bill willingly or changes it into a different subject through the so-called gut and amend process.
Yeah, I was saying, they have all these interesting terms, gut and amend, hijack, we'll get into that in a second. Let me ask you this. Is it true that state legislatures can only introduce a limited number of bills? I believe it's 40 in any 2-year session.
Yeah, our state legislators, it used to be 40 for both houses. California is in the minority of states. The vast majority do not have bill limits. California's legislature adopted by internal rules in the Assembly and the Senate limits in the mid-1990s, and they both started at 40 bills per 2-year session. In 2016, so beginning with the 2017 legislative session, the Assembly increased their number to 50 per 2-year session.
It seems like we see a lot of bills in front of the legislature, though, every year, and it's my understanding that there are no limits on how many bills can be submitted to drafting to the Office of Legislative Counsel, which is, I guess, the ultimate seal of approval in Sacramento and an indispensable step before any proposal becomes law. So to get around the bills per legislator limit, I believe there's something called an unbacked bill. What are they and what's their role in the legislative process?
No, that's not the way. The only way to get around the bill limit is to get the Assembly Rules Committee, if you're an Assembly member, or the Senate Rules Committee, if you're a senator, to allow you an exception. I'm not aware of legislators for many, many years now who have sought permission of the Rules Committee in either house to go above that limit. The backing versus unbacking is a phrase or a terminology used by the Office of Legislative Counsel. What backing means is that they have what we call a jacket. It's basically a folder on which the bill author and any co-authors sign their name, and it has in it the language of the bill. So when a bill is first introduced, it must have that jacket that is prepared by the Office of Legislative Counsel in order for the bill to be introduced. So what does unbacked mean? Unbacked means the legislator's name is not on it. Oh. And so what you do is that a lobbyist or an interest group might go to their local assembly member or senator and say, could you please have legislative counsel draft an unbacked bill? Yeah. And that allows us to decide whether or not we're going to use it or to go and find a legislator to author it.
Yeah, I've actually asked legislative counsel through a legislator for a legal opinion on something. It was actually very, very helpful because it was very believable when I presented it to the folks we were presenting it to. So in a minute here, we're going to talk about one is a bill, not just a bill. It can take any manner of form sometimes. Gut and amend, we just talked about, is one way. And sometimes it's really part of the gruesome art of legislation making. We're going to talk about that in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. You know, Otto von Bismarck once famously stated that, quote, laws are like sausages. It's better not to see them being made, unquote. So how are laws made? We're talking with Chris Micheli. He's an attorney who's also a lobbyist who's authored several books on the California legislative process. So the legislative committee chairmen play a critical role in making laws. How were those committee chairmanships awarded or selected?
The Senate leader, the pro tempore of the Senate, Tony Atkins, a Democrat from San Diego, and Robert Rivas, the newly installed Speaker of the California State Assembly, are vested with the power by the Assembly and Senate rules to appoint all of the members of the committees, including both the chairs and the vice chairs. And so it's up to them to decide who will take those positions.
You know, there's something I read about one way to kill a bill, something called a suspense file by the Appropriations Committee. Can you describe how that works?
Yeah, so years ago, more than 3 decades ago, the two appropriations committees, which is a little bit of a misnomer, Mark, because those committees do not appropriate money. They consider the fiscal impact of legislation that is being considered by the legislature and the Assembly and Senate. So they're both named the appropriations committees. And what they've done is they've created this suspense file in each committee, which is any bill that has more than basically either 50 or 150,000, depending on the House threshold. If it's anything above that, then it goes to suspense, and they consider them all together in one day's hearing and vote them all out or hold a certain number.
Wow, all in one day. Well, listen, let's talk about, we talked earlier about this gut and amend tactic. It sounds kind of gruesome, frankly. Why is it used and how does it work?
Yeah, well, to continue on the gruesome side, you know, gutting is taking out the contents of the bill. It's akin to, you know, taking the guts out of a fish or something, you know, and amending or putting in entirely new language. In theory, it is prohibited by the rules because both rules in the Assembly and Senate require any amendments or changes to a bill to be germane or reasonably related to the current contents of the bill. What do I mean by that? The bill got introduced dealing with transportation funding. A gut and amend could turn it into a, you know, education type bill. That is not germane. Those amendments are not germane.
Yeah.
However,
but are they giving quite a lot of latitude though in that regard?
Yes. What I was going to say is that technically either house, 41 members in the Assembly, a majority, or 21 members in the Senate, a majority of the state Senate, can decide if anyone objects to whether or not amendments are germane. What does that mean practically, Mark? It means the germaneness rule is not enforced today anymore. And so basically legislators can gut and amend, change the contents of their bills within a certain period of time. They can do that.
Okay, what about these things called trailer bills that are often inserted into the budget each year? Can you explain what they are and how that process works?
Yeah, they are an integral part of the California state budget. There are basically three legislative measures, all bills that are part of our budget every year. The budget bill, there's just one of those. It's the main bill that appropriates, the $300 billion California state budget. And it's more than 1,000 pages in length. It's all the appropriations and what we call things like budget control language, helping to dictate or determine where those funds and how they're spent, where they're spent and how. The second is what we call a budget bill junior, and that is basically a bill that makes modifications to the budget bill, the appropriation, the spending aspects of it. There can be anywhere from 2 or 3 to as high as 7 or 8. The last category, Mark, is trailer bills. And trailer bills are intended to make statutory changes to implement the California state budget. So they play a critical role.
Can you give us a quick example of a recent trailer bill?
Sure, there are generally more than 24 of them every year, ranging from education, higher education, public safety, natural resources, transportation, labor, etc. Again, there's anywhere from a low of 12 to 15 to a high of 25 or 30 every year.
Okay, well, I guess we just learned a little bit about how legislative sausage is made, I guess. What can be done to make it a little more transparent? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. The Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis famously opined that, quote, sunlight is the best disinfectant, unquote, for political corruption. Is anything being done, or should it be done, to make state government more transparent? We're talking with Chris Micheli. He's with government relations and advocacy firm Apparia and Micheli. There seems to be some bipartisan support, at least publicly, to make the legislative process more transparent. It may be the one thing that the parties actually agree on. But if that's so, why has it been so difficult to do work in this area to make the process more transparent?
Well, it's transparent for those who are, regularly involved in the process. For the average citizen, it's a little harder. Committee hearings they take place in Sacramento at the state capitol or an office building about 2 blocks away, which are temporary quarters for legislators while they build the new annex. There are some committees after COVID that have returned to in-person testimony only. And there are some that do allow telephone testimony, which does enable people to participate remotely. All of the bills and amendments and the committee and floor analyses are on the internet. They get posted before hearings. The legislature has to post after the fact, of course, within 24 hours, every committee hearing and every floor session. So there's an opportunity to keep track of what's going on. Participation is still really the traditional way of meeting with your legislator, communicating, making phone calls, sending letters.
Yeah, but a lot, but there are certain special interests that pay money in the political process. A lot of people see that certain special interest goes to one part or the other. For example, a lot of people think that corporate money only goes to Republicans and that maybe union money only goes to Democrats. Sometimes, though, special interests really aren't all that special. Instead, a political influence game seems to be played by hedging your bets. Can you explain how that works?
Well, I think those, particularly in the California business community, do that. I think your earlier statement, traditionally have labor unions backed Democratic legislators, capital D Democratic, generally yes. Business interests, generally Republican. But in the last 2 or 3 decades, the business community in particular has had to be much more involved in Democratic races and supporting a lot of so-called moderate Democrats or pro-business Democrats to help offset the influence of labor unions and our super duper majority of Democratic legislators in our 2 houses of the California.
And that's been going on for a while, that the supermajority in both houses of the legislature. Let me talk about lobbying for a moment, though. In short, how do lobbyists help or hurt the legislative process, in your opinion?
Well, the two main roles of lobbyists are to educate decision makers and their staff, elected officials and their staff, as well as appointed ones in the executive branch, and of course to advocate on behalf of their clients. Ultimately the decisions are up to the elected officials, i.e. the 120 legislators, and of course the governor in signing or vetoing bills. So lobbyists are able to communicate on behalf of their clients. For a lot of groups, it's helpful to hear from lobbyists to bring their perspective. Of course, a good legislator and his or her staff are going to hopefully hear from both sides of an issue, both sides of a bill, before they make their decisions, so that they don't rely only on one voice or one interest group.
Well, lobbying, though, doesn't guarantee success, of course. I mean, can you give some examples of where a lot of money was spent by lobbyists, but not much of a result? What happened?
Well, certainly the petroleum industry has been written about the last year or two, as they've been targeted for quite a bit of legislative and executive branch regulations. But, you have to put it in perspective. A year ago, Governor Newsom had proposed an excess profits tax on the oil industry, and what was ultimately enacted in early 2023, earlier this year, in a special session to deal with this topic, was a bill that grants authority to the California Energy Commission to try to put together how the price of gas comes about, whether or not there is some sort of excess profit being made, and then how they might financially dissuade them from excess profits.
The devil's in the details, so that's how the lobbyists can kind of influence the process a little bit. We're running up to the deadline in this segment. I want to talk to you in the next segment a little more about this, but how can we improve the legislative process? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. There once was a time, the fairy tale goes, and while it's hard to believe in this age of vitriol and hyper-partisan politics, there once really was a time when Republican leaders and Democratic leaders liked and trusted each other. Some have referred to it as the golden age of California politics. Are those days just a distant memory, or can we aspire to be that again? What can be done to improve the legislative process? We're talking with Chris Micheli. He co-authored several books in the California legislative process. So, Chris, over the years, I've heard it from a number of people that said that, Democratic leader Willie Brown and Republican leader Ken Maddy, who the Maddy Institute is named after, would really fight over policies. But at the end of the day, they were able to work together because they trusted each other. How important is integrity and collegiality when it comes to the effective legislating?
I think it's really important, particularly now today when there's a super majority in both houses of the legislature. I was fortunate enough to start my career just as the tenure of Speaker Brown and Senate Republican leader Ken Maddy were coming to a close. So I got to see them in their last 2 years or so in office. And I agree with you. Speaker Brown often talked about several Republican legislators, including Ken Maddy. Every Tuesday night, they would go to the movies after session because everyone was up here in Sacramento away from their district. So they fought during the day in committee and on the floors of the Assembly and Senate, but after hours they socialized and got along very well. And I think ultimately we have to return to that.
We actually have, every year we've had fundraisers up in Sacramento to support scholarships for Valley students. And the MC virtually every year has been Willie Brown. And I once asked him, I said, why do you come up from San Francisco to do a fundraiser for Valley, basically students to work in Valley legislative offices who are primarily Republican? And he said it's because he felt so highly toward or likes Ken Maddy so much. So that really speaks a lot about how the process used to be. Exactly. You're a lobbyist who generally represents business interests. Have you ever crossed the aisle to work with lobbyists representing labor?
Oh, all the time. In fact, a number of years ago, I worked on important legislation for the business community that only came together because my friends in the labor community were willing to negotiate and come up with a language that they didn't object to and that was beneficial to my client. And so, yes, I do it all of the time. Look, even though we may disagree on policy, we still have to work together, and we have to figure out how to make some of these bills workable. Even if labor wants to impose a new mandate on employers, you have to make it so employers can comply with it.
Right. You can't have a job if there's no business, right? Let me ask you this. And this is it's important because I've seen this over the years working at the Maddy Institute. It seems to be that compromise has become a dirty word in politics. But isn't compromise, getting to yes, essential in a pluralistic democracy? I mean, how can you get anything done if you have a kind of a take it or leave it approach to legislating?
Well, Mark, I think that's one of the problems that we've seen in recent years when we have reached what is now being dubbed the super duper majority in the two houses, well above supermajority status, more than 2/3 in both houses. And when you don't need the minority party for anything really, even for the budget no more, right? It's just the majority vote budget today. It used to be a 2/3. And because of that, it leads to more of a take it or leave it mentality as opposed to a collaborative bipartisan effort.
But you're even seeing that, frankly, at the federal level where, say the Republicans in the House cannot have a Democrat join them. It has to be a Republican-only proposal. I think that's really, wouldn't that be kind of problematic? I mean, it's difficult to do unless you have a really solid majority, but when you have a very thin majority, that becomes pretty problematic.
Yeah, and it doesn't speak well to our democracy in general. Again, when I started my lobbying career, there was much greater partiality between the two houses in terms of partisan makeup, and it caused both parties to work collaboratively on public policy issues, and we're getting further and further away from that.
Yeah, let's hope we get back to that someday. That's the goal. So I want to thank our guest, Chris Micheli. He does government relations and advocacy with the firm of Apparia and Micheli. Thanks again very much for joining us, Chris. If you want to stay up with state and local politics, you can get our free e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, or follow us on social media by simply logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.